Cassie Miller stood by the kitchen sink, watching as the darkness outside slowly swallowed the remnants of the day. The cold January wind rattled the old wooden frames, and the house filled with the sounds of creaking floorboards, as if the building itself was complaining about the hardships of winter. She clutched a mug of unfinished coffee, feeling the warmth of the ceramic barely resisting the icy touches of the air in the room. This house, their house, had always been too big for two people. Once it rang with laughter, the echo of footsteps and voices, but now all that remained was silence, interspersed with the echoes of the past. The emptiness became especially palpable in winter, when the cold crept through the walls and the old heating struggled to cope. The sound of a car engine pulled her out of her thoughts. Finn was back. Cassie glanced at the clock. 10:47 p.m., late even by his standards. She walked to the front door, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. The door opened with a soft creak and Finn entered, closing the cold gust of wind behind him. His face looked tired, as if the heavy day had imprinted itself in every movement and glance. Dark circles lay under his eyes and his shoulders were hunched, as if he carried an invisible burden. "Tough day." Cassie greeted him with a warm smile, though she felt a pang of concern inside. Finn looked even more exhausted than usual. "You could say that," he muttered, taking off his jacket and hanging it on a hook. His voice sounded dull, with a hint of dejection. Finn walked into the kitchen, sat down on a chair, and ran his hand over his face. Cassie silently placed a cup of hot tea in front of him. They always understood each other without many words, but today something was off. "You're working too much," she said gently, sitting down opposite him. "You need to rest, Finn. I can see you're exhausted." He nodded but didn't respond. His gaze wandered around the room, avoiding meeting her eyes. "Have you eaten today?" she asked. "Yeah, I grabbed something. Don't worry." But she worried. How could she not when her only son returned home so depleted? Since his father's death 10 years ago, Finn had become her sole support, her comfort. They had grown accustomed to relying on each other, but sometimes she felt she was asking too much of him. "If you're not feeling well, you can lie down in my room," she offered. "Your room is still so cold, and mine is warmer." Finn thought for a moment, then nodded. He knew that refusing was pointless, and deep down he was probably grateful for her insistence. Cassie covered the bed with a thick blanket, turning on the old oil heater that barely gave off heat. Finn lay down, and she felt his body sink into the mattress, as if he finally had a chance to relax. "Thanks, Mom," he said softly. She smiled, adjusting the blanket. Finn was already closing his eyes, and she noticed his breathing beginning to slow down. She thought he was falling asleep quickly, but before she left, she caught his whisper. "Don't go." Those words stopped her. Something in his voice, vulnerable and almost childlike, touched her deeply. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly lay down next to him on top of the blanket so he wouldn't feel alone. Finn moved closer, as if seeking warmth. Cassie lay still, feeling her heart begin to beat a little faster. She told herself it was just a moment of weakness, nothing more. But when Finn gently hugged her, as he used to do as a child, she couldn't help but remember how much he depended on her back then. Now he was a grown man, but at that moment, he seemed like the same lost boy she wanted to protect from the whole world. And yet, in that silence, under that old blanket, a tension arose between them that she couldn't ignore. Darkness filled the bedroom like a thick fog, and the faint glow of the streetlight barely penetrated the drawn curtains. Cassie lay in bed, hearing the old wooden beams of the house creaking from the cold. Finn slept beside her, his breathing steady, but the air in the room seemed charged with tension. She turned her head and looked at him. Even in sleep, his face remained tired, as if the strain of life didn't let go of him, even in moments of rest. The warmth of his body penetrated through the layers of the blanket, and this simple fact evoked a strange feeling in Cassie. She had always prided herself on their closeness, a rare bond they had maintained after the death of her husband and his father. But tonight, something had changed, as if the cold outside had turned the familiar warmth into something heavier and deeper. She tried to reassure herself, repeating that it was just her maternal care, her duty to protect Finn, especially now, when he was so obviously exhausted. But the closeness of his body, The warmth emanating from him felt unfamiliar. She found it strange to admit to herself that she felt not only care, but something else. Something she didn't want to name. Finn stirred and his hand accidentally touched her shoulder. She froze, afraid to disturb his sleep, but the gesture was so gentle and natural that it made her hold her breath. He moved closer, as if seeking more warmth. There was nothing intentional in his movement, and yet it made her feel vulnerable. Cassie lay still, feeling her thoughts begin to tangle. She remembered how many times she had sat by his bed when he was sick as a child, how she had stroked his hair to soothe him. But this was not the same. There was something else in this touch, something elusive, almost instinctive. It's just closeness, she told herself. Mother and son. We're just going through tough times. But even these words sounded unconvincing, as if she was trying to convince herself that nothing unusual was happening. Finn stirred again, and his hand gently wrapped around her waist. This gesture was so simple that Cassie felt a slight chill run down her spine. She could have moved away, broken this contact, but instead, she remained in place, feeling the room grow even quieter. Even the sound of the wind outside the window seemed distant. Her heart beat faster when she felt his breathing become slower, deeper. He seemed to be falling asleep, and she remained caught in this moment, unable to leave or fully relax. She wanted to believe it was just maternal care, but something inside screamed that it wasn't. She remembered how close they had been after his father's death. Finn had always been a sensitive boy, and Cassie did everything she could to keep him from feeling alone. But now he was a grown man, and something in this closeness disrupted the natural order of things. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound, almost like a sigh. She turned her head and saw that Finn was looking at her. His eyes, usually hiding emotions, were soft, filled with something she couldn't read. "Are you okay?" she whispered, trying to keep her voice calm. He didn't answer right away, but his gaze didn't leave hers. Finally, he nodded, but the movement was so slight she almost didn't notice. "Thanks for staying," he said quietly. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was something in it that made her feel a strange mix of warmth and anxiety. "Of course," she replied, not knowing what else to say. He closed his eyes again, but his hand remained on her waist, and Cassie felt her mind struggling with itself. This was a moment that felt wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to break it. The night continued to drag on slowly. The silence of the room seemed almost deafening, and Cassie lay there, feeling the tension in the air growing. She knew this moment would stay with her, becoming something she would replay in her mind over and over, wondering where the thin line between maternal care and something more began. When Finn stirred again, she felt his arm tighten around her, and he pressed closer, as if afraid she would leave. She felt the warmth of his body, his breath on her neck. And though her mind screamed that this was wrong, her body remained still, as if it couldn't resist this closeness. Cassie closed her eyes, hoping sleep would free her from these thoughts. But she knew this night would be the beginning of something she couldn't simply forget. Morning came like an invisible thief, slowly tinting the darkness of the bedroom with gray light. Cassie woke up from the sensation of silence, too deep to be ordinary. Finn was no longer lying beside her. She lingered for a moment on the empty space where he had slept and felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. In the kitchen, she found him sitting at the table with a cup of coffee in his hands. Finn looked like he had slept for only a few hours. His shoulders were tense, and his gaze was focused on something invisible outside the window. She stopped in the doorway, watching him. He seemed almost like a stranger at that moment, a grown man she had known all her life, but didn't understand now. "Good morning," she said softly, approaching him. Finn barely nodded. His face remained inscrutable, but Cassie felt that behind this outward calm lay something much greater. "You're up early," she noted, hoping that small talk would ease the tension. "Couldn't sleep," he replied curtly, not taking his eyes off the window. Her heart ached. She knew that something had arisen between them that they both feared to name. Their usual closeness, which had always been their salvation, now felt alien and frightening. Later, when Finn left for work, Cassie tried to immerse herself in household chores to distract herself. She was sorting through old photos in a box stored in the closet and came across a snapshot that brought a wave of memories. The photo showed her, Finn, and her husband Daniel standing by a lake during a summer picnic. Finn was just a boy, his face radiant with joy, and Daniel was hugging them both. It was a moment filled with happiness and unity that now seemed so distant. She couldn't help but remember the day Daniel died in an accident. He was only 38 in the center of their lives. After his death, Cassie had to take on all the responsibility for the family, becoming for Finn everything he had lost. They endured this together, comforting each other in the darkest moments. Cassie didn't notice when she started crying again. She wiped away the tears and returned to the photos, but now looking through them brought pain. Suddenly, her gaze fell on a photo of Finn in his teenage years standing next to her. With the same open, loving expression she had seen last night, these memories brought up questions she was afraid to ask herself. She remembered how many times she found comfort in Finn, how he became not just her son, but her support, her friend, her only companion in this house. Had they become too close? Had this bond crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed? That evening, when Finn returned, a tension hung between them that they both tried to ignore. They sat in the living room watching an old movie, but neither could concentrate. The screen was lit, but the room felt filled with silent questions. "Mom," Finn suddenly said. His voice was soft, but there was something in it that made her shiver. She turned to him, trying not to show her anxiety. "Yes?" He paused for a moment, as if choosing his words. "Have you ever thought about how everything became like this?" His voice faltered, as if he was afraid to say the last word. "What do you mean?" Cassie felt her heart race. "About us," he said quietly. His gaze, full of embarrassment and pain, met hers. Cassie couldn't answer right away. She felt a surge of panic. "We've just been through a lot together, Finn," she finally said. "That's all, it's normal." But even as she said it, she knew she was lying. None of this was normal. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. The sharp sound pulled them both out of their tense silence. Cassie hurried to open the door and found Jack Lawson, their neighbor, standing on the porch. His warm smile and friendly tone were an unexpected contrast to her inner turmoil. "Hey, Cassie, I thought I'd come by and see if you need any help with the heating. I know it's been a bit colder lately, and I can help with any issues if you've got them," he said with a slight smile. Cassie smiled at him, though her thoughts were still with Finn. "Thanks, Jack. I really appreciate it," she replied, stepping aside to let him in. Jack started working on the heater, but Cassie felt Finn watching them from the living room. His gaze was tense, almost jealous, though he tried to hide it. When Jack left, Finn abruptly stood up from the couch. "Do you always let him come in here?" he asked with a hint of irritation in his voice. "Finn, he's just helping. We've known him for a few years," she said, but her voice also held tension. Finn just scoffed and headed to his room, leaving her standing in confusion. She felt the shadow of the past, their loss, and their unresolved feelings continuing to grow, threatening to tear apart their familiar world. The house sank into its usual silence, but Cassie felt the silence becoming thick, almost tangible. She busied herself with household chores, but her thoughts kept returning to the morning. Finn's gaze at breakfast, his distant voice, it all left a bitter aftertaste, as if a crack had formed between them that only deepened. She found herself standing by the window, watching the setting sun cast long shadows on the street. Finn was in his room. Since he returned from work, he had barely come out, and this was unlike him. Usually he would at least spend time with her, even if silently watching TV or reading a book. But today he was avoiding her, and this feeling of his distance was painful for Cassie. Late evening brought even more cold. Cassie was about to go to bed when she heard a knock at the door. She jumped. The unexpected sound in the quiet house was almost deafening. On the porch stood Jack Lawson, their neighbor. His warm smile and slightly awkward gaze always reminded her that behind his friendly facade lay a desire to be something more than just a neighbor. "Hey, Cassie. Sorry it's late, but I thought maybe you still need help with the heating," he said, clutching a small set of tools in his hands. Cassie looked at him uncertainly, then nodded. "Yeah, sure, thanks, Jack. It's always colder in this house than it should be in winter. She tried to smile, but her thoughts were still with Finn. Jack came inside and headed to the old heater. Cassie stood nearby, watching his actions, when she heard Finn's footsteps. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face dark with emotions he was clearly trying to hide. "Who's this?" he asked sharply, his gaze lingering on Jack. "Jack," Cassie replied calmly. "He's helping with the heater." Finn said nothing, but his gaze remained on Jack longer than necessary. Cassie felt the tension in the room beginning to rise. When Jack finished, he turned to Cassie and, slightly embarrassed, said, "Well, it should be a bit warmer now. If you need anything else, let me know." "Thanks, Jack," she replied, feeling her voice sound a little softer than she intended. Jack lingered for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more, but then just nodded briefly to Finn and left. The door closed behind him, and the silence filled the house again. Finn stood with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the door. "He comes here too often," he finally said. Cassie turned to him, surprised by his tone. "He's just helping, Finn. It's not a problem." "Are you sure?" His voice sounded tense, almost accusatory. "What's going on with you?" she asked, feeling irritation seep into her voice. "He's just a neighbor." Finn fell silent, his face still serious. But there was something else in his eyes, something Cassie couldn't immediately understand. He turned away and started toward the stairs, but halfway he stopped. "Just be careful," he said softly without turning his head. Then he left, leaving her alone in the kitchen, where the air seemed even colder. Later, lying in her bed, Cassie couldn't sleep. Thoughts of Finn wouldn't leave her alone. She tried to remember the moment when their relationship began to change, but nothing specific came to mind. Their closeness had always been strong, but now there was something new in it, something heavy and frightening. Memories of the time after Daniel's death surfaced. Finn was just a teenager then, and his pain mirrored her own. They had always found comfort in each other, but now Cassie wondered if this bond had become too strong. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat when she heard Finn's voice. "Mom? Are you awake?" "Yes, come in," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. He entered, his face tense, as if he had been gathering the courage to come here for a long time. "I just wanted to apologize for how I acted," he said, looking down at the floor. Cassie sat up on the bed and patted the spot next to her. Finn approached and sat down, his shoulders slumped, his hands clenched into fists. "It's okay, Finn. We're just going through a tough time," she said softly. "We're just lost right now." He looked up and met her eyes. "It's just that sometimes I feel like I don't know how to handle this. With us, with this house, with you." His words hung in the air, and Cassie felt the tension between them rise again. She wanted to say something, but instead she just touched his hand. Finn didn't pull away. His fingers gently closed around her hand, and this touch was too long to be accidental. Cassie felt her heart beat faster, and she quickly withdrew her hand, standing up from the bed. "We both need to get some sleep," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. Finn nodded, but his gaze still lingered on her, and in that gaze there was something that sent a chill down her spine. When he left, Cassie stood alone, looking into the darkness. She knew something inevitable was approaching, and she feared what this moment would bring. The house was drowned in nighttime silence, but Cassie felt the silence ringing with tension. The old walls seemed to contain something that shouldn't be let out. She sat on the edge of the bed, hugging herself, trying to warm up or perhaps calm down. Her thoughts swirled in a whirlwind, returning to the events of the past few days. The door opened with a soft creak, and Finn appeared in the doorway. His face was shadowed by the nightlight, making him look almost like a stranger. He looked like he had spent countless hours in thought before coming here. "Mom!" His voice sounded muffled but restrained. "We need to talk." Her heart tightened. She knew this moment was inevitable, but she feared it. "About what, Finn?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm, but her hands gripped the edge of the blanket, betraying her tension. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "About us," he said, sitting down on the chair opposite her. His eyes searched hers, but Cassie avoided meeting his gaze. "Everything has become different." You feel it too, right? Her breath became uneven. These words sounded too close to what she had been trying to avoid. Finn, it's just a tough period, she began, hoping her voice would sound convincing. We've been through a lot, that's all. But even she felt how weak this argument sounded. Finn shook his head. No, it's not just a tough period. You know it's not, Mom. His voice was soft but firm. Everything has changed, and you feel it just as much as I do. Silence filled the room, becoming almost tangible. Cassie felt her heart beating faster. She couldn't look away from his gaze, in which there was something she couldn't explain. Finn, her voice faltered. She wanted to say something that would bring them back to the familiar, safe reality, but the words stuck in her throat. Finn reached out to touch her hand. His fingers gently covered her palm. It was a simple touch, but it felt incredibly heavy, as if it carried the weight of their past. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable, he said, looking straight into her eyes. But I can't hide this anymore. Her breath became uneven. She didn't know what to say. The words that could have resolved the situation vanished from her mind. Finn, we can't, she began, but fell silent, seeing his face. In it was a mix of pain, tenderness, and confusion that mirrored her own feelings. He stood up, coming closer, and knelt before her. His gaze didn't leave hers, and in that gaze was something that made her freeze. Mom, his voice was soft, almost a whisper. You've been everything to me from the start. I always wanted you to be happy, but I can't pretend I don't feel anything anymore. She felt her own emotions rising to the surface. Pain, love, fear. It all mixed into one knot that threatened to tear her apart. Finn slowly leaned closer, but stopped, as if waiting for her to push him away. Her mind screamed that this was wrong, but her body didn't move. She saw in his eyes something familiar and yet frightening, the same vulnerability that had always been between them. Finn, this isn't right, she whispered, but her words sounded uncertain even to herself. He moved closer again, but his movements were cautious, almost trembling. Their faces were so close that she could feel his breath. The room was so quiet that her own heartbeat seemed deafening. Her hand reached up to stop him, but instead it rested on his cheek. This gesture was so natural that she didn't immediately realize what she was doing. Finn closed his eyes as if her touch brought him long-awaited relief. We can't, she whispered again, but her voice trembled and her hand remained on his face. It doesn't matter anymore, he replied, his voice sounding as if he didn't expect forgiveness, but still sought it. The silence became too heavy. Cassie felt all her inner barriers crumbling under his gaze, under his touch. She didn't know what would happen next, but she understood one thing. This moment would change them forever. Morning came unexpectedly quickly, as if the night had passed in an instant. Cassie sat at the kitchen table, clutching a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The house, usually filled with silence, now seemed too loud. Every creak of the floorboards under her feet, every gust of wind outside the window, evoked an inexplicable anxiety in her. Finn hadn't come out of his room. Since the moment they said goodbye at her bedroom door last night, they hadn't exchanged a word. And though the silence was familiar, now it felt almost torturous. Cassie looked up when she heard Finn's door open. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair disheveled, his eyes dark from a sleepless night. He looked vulnerable but determined, and this immediately put her on guard. Good morning, she said softly, hiding her concern behind a strained smile. Finn nodded, not responding. He sat down across from her, his hands resting on the table, and she noticed his fingers nervously tapping the surface. We need to talk, he said finally. His voice was firm, but there was a hint of turmoil in it. Cassie felt her heart tighten. She knew this moment was inevitable, but she had hoped to postpone it a little longer. Finn, she began, but he raised his hand, stopping her. No, Mom. This time I'll say it. He sighed, looking down at his hands. I've been thinking about this all night, about us, about what happened, and I realized we can't keep going like this. Her eyes widened. These words sounded like a verdict, though she knew he was right. I've been thinking about it too, Finn, she said softly. We need to move forward. You need to move forward. He looked up, and in his eyes there was a flash of something like pain. Does that mean you want me to leave? he asked, his voice soft but filled with deep hurt. She looked down, her fingers trembling as she played with the edge of a napkin. I think we both need space, she finally said. You're young, Finn. You need to find yourself, your own life. This doesn't mean I want you to disappear. It means we both need to learn to be separate. The words hung in the air, and the tension between them became almost unbearable. Finn was silent for a long time, then nodded, as if he too had come to this decision within himself. Okay, he said softly. I'll leave. She wanted to hug him, comfort him, but she understood that this would only complicate everything. Instead, she struggled to keep herself from giving in to her emotions. I'll help you pack your things, she offered, but he shook his head. No need, I'll manage, he replied, his voice sounding detached. The next few hours passed in silence. Finn packed his things and Cassie tried to keep herself busy with routine chores, but her thoughts were far away. She knew she was taking the right step, but it didn't make the pain any easier. When he was ready, they met at the front door. His suitcase stood beside him, and his face reflected a mix of determination and regret. I don't know how to do this, he confessed. Just do it, Finn, she replied, her voice trembling. It will be hard, but you'll manage. We'll manage. He came closer, and she finally allowed herself to hug him. It was a warm but painful goodbye, filled with everything they couldn't express in words. When the door closed behind him, Cassie stood still, looking at the empty hallway. The house seemed too big, too quiet. She didn't know how long she would stand there, but she knew that now she had to live with the loneliness.